Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Let me introduce myself. My name is Valinda Sari with NPM 2341110 from class MNJ 23A. On this occasion I will explain from the hypothesis testing. In the context of research methodology, hypothesis testing is a scientific process used to determine whether an assumption or conjecture put forward by researchers regarding a phenomenon can be accepted or rejected, based on the empirical data obtained. The hypothesis itself is a temporary statement that must still be proven true through the research process. In practice, the hypothesis is formulated as a temporary answer to the formulation of the research problem, and has an important position because it is a guideline in designing data collection methods, analysis techniques, and in drawing conclusions from the research results. In general, hypotheses are divided into two, namely the null hypothesis, H, and the alternative hypothesis, H or HA. The null hypothesis states that there is no difference, influence, or relationship between the variables studied, while the alternative hypothesis states that there is a significant difference, influence, or relationship. Hypothesis testing is carried out with the aim of testing the truth of the null hypothesis based on data obtained from the research sample. If the results of the analysis show that the data does not support the null hypothesis, then the null hypothesis is rejected and the alternative hypothesis is accepted. However, if the data is not strong enough to reject the null hypothesis, then the null hypothesis is still accepted, with the note that it does not mean that it is proven true, but there is not enough evidence to reject it. Before conducting hypothesis testing, researchers must first formulate a clear hypothesis, then determine the level of significance or error rate, alpha, which is usually set at 0.055%, or 0.011%. This level of significance indicates the tolerance limit for the possibility of making an error in rejecting a null hypothesis that is actually true, which is called a type I error. In addition, there is also a type II error, namely an error in accepting the null hypothesis when it should be rejected. After determining the level of significance, researchers then choose a statistical technique that is appropriate to the type of data and the purpose of the test. This technique can be a t-test to compare two means, a chi-square test for categorical data, an ANOVA test for more than two groups, a regression test to measure the relationship between variables, or others as needed. The next step is to calculate the statistical value of the data obtained, then compare it with the critical value of the statistical distribution used, or use the p-value. If the statistical value exceeds the critical value or if the p-value is smaller than alpha, then the null hypothesis is rejected. However, if the statistical value is smaller than the critical value or the p-value is greater than alpha, then the null hypothesis is not rejected. It is important to understand that this decision does not state that the null hypothesis is absolutely true or false, but rather based on the probability and statistical evidence available. In its application, hypothesis testing is closely related to the type of data, nominal, ordinal, interval, or ratio, and the purpose of the study, whether to find out the difference, influence, or relationship. For example, in quantitative research that wants to find out whether digital marketing training has an effect on increasing MSME sales, researchers will formulate a null hypothesis that there is no effect of training on sales, and an alternative hypothesis that training has a significant effect on sales. By taking sales data before and after training from two groups, experimental group and control group, researchers can use the t-test to find out whether there is a statistically significant difference in average sales. In the practice of hypothesis testing, it is important for researchers to pay attention to the validity and reliability of the data, the suitability of the analysis technique, and the correct interpretation of the results so that the conclusions drawn can be scientifically justified. In addition, hypothesis testing must also be equipped with an understanding of the theoretical and empirical context of the research object, so that the results of the analysis are not only statistically meaningful, but also substantively meaningful. That is the presentation that I can convey. I end with wassalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.